Hi, everybody. Tonight, I'd like to take you on a quiet, meandering journey, a story set in an era long past, of lantern-lit streets, the soft strum of a shamisen, and lives lived behind the painted curtain. This is a tale about devotion, transformation, and tradition, about a girl who once walked the narrow alleyways of Gion, Kyoto, and how she became something more, something unforgettable. Tonight, I'm telling you the story of my life as a geisha and everything that came after. Our tale will unfold slowly in 24 parts. Each part reveals a different chapter of my life, from childhood innocence to the quiet ache of maturity. As we go along, you'll hear the hush of autumn leaves falling in the courtyard, the echo of laughter behind closed shoji screens, and the hush-hush of silk kimono against wooden floors. So get comfortable, let the world outside fade, and let's begin slowly. I was born in a small seaside town that always smelled of salt and rain. The waves came and went with a kind of thoughtful rhythm, as if they too were counting time. My parents were humble people, my father a fisherman whose skin was as dark as driftwood from the sun, and my mother a seamstress whose hands could coax the finest patterns into even the coarsest cloth. We lived in a modest wooden home, perched precariously on a hill that overlooked the harbor. When I was small, I would sit on the edge of that hill, squatting like a frog, watching the boats rock gently in the distance, my chin in my palms. I had no siblings, only a stray cat named Momo who came and went as she pleased, and a neighbor boy named Haruki who always had scraped knees and dirt under his fingernails. We were inseparable back then, chasing dragonflies in the tall grass, daring each other to swim further out and laughing when the waves knocked us over. We were children who didn't yet know the weight of the world. Not yet. But the world has its way of reminding you that innocence is fleeting. I was 9 when the sickness came for my father. It was a slow, wheezing illness that stole his strength little by little, until the man I once saw lift barrels over his shoulders now struggled to hold a bowl of soup. My mother never complained. She stitched during the day and kept a wet cloth on his forehead through the night. But there was a look in her eyes, tired, watery, distant. When he passed, it was quiet. No wailing, no dramatic scenes, just the sound of the waves crashing in the background and the wind rattling the bamboo shutters. The town mourned quietly, and my mother didn't speak for 2 weeks. I remember sitting at the edge of the harbor not long after, my bare feet dangling just above the water. Haruki was beside me, chewing on a stalk of grass like he always did when he didn't know what to say. After a long silence, he whispered, "Will you leave now?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. But life, I would come to understand, has its own current, and sometimes it sweeps you away whether you're ready or not. When I was 11, a woman in a plum-colored kimono came to our house. She smelled like jasmine and walked like her feet barely touched the ground. She spoke softly, her voice like water pouring over stones. Her name was Okasan. She had come from Kyoto, from a place I had only heard of in passing, a place with wide rivers, ancient temples, and women who wore the moonlight on their faces. She told my mother she ran an okiya, a geisha house, and was looking for young girls to train in the arts. Dance, music, conversation, elegance. She has the eyes for it, she said, pointing at me. Quiet eyes, they will remember her. At first, my mother said no, but poverty is a relentless tide. It wears you down over time. That winter, with our savings dwindling and the seamstress work fading, she said yes. Through tears and silence, she signed the papers. I didn't know whether to feel sorrow or excitement. All I knew was that I was leaving everything behind. My town, my hill, the salty breeze, Haruki, even Momo. We traveled by train. I had never ridden a train before. The countryside rushed past my window in a blur of green and gold, and I clutched my little suitcase like it held the last pieces of my former life. Okasan sat beside me, sipping tea from a thermos and humming a tune I didn't recognize. When we arrived in Kyoto, it was night. The city pulsed with quiet elegance. Lanterns glowed like fireflies suspended in the air, and the cobbled streets gleamed from a recent rain. The okiya was nestled deep in Gion, behind a lacquered red gate and a curtain of weeping willows. A house of shadows and stories. Inside, everything smelled of incense and old wood. The floors creaked like they were whispering secrets. I was led to a room with tatami mats and paper sliding doors. My futon had already been laid out, and a yukata folded neatly beside it. "You will rise at 5," said the older woman who would later become my senior. "And no talking after dinner." That night, I cried into my pillow. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet stream that soaked the cotton. I didn't miss home, not yet. What I missed was the sound of the waves, the rhythm that had always been there. I thought of Haruki. I wondered if he'd noticed I was gone. I wondered if he missed the way we used to pretend to be sea spirits or climb trees too tall for children. I wondered if Momo still slept on the windowsill, but the wind here sounded different, and the shadows moved more slowly. And I knew, even then, that the girl who had sat on that hill overlooking the harbor, she would not return. And that, my dear listener, was how my journey began. Not with fanfare, not with promise, but with the soft footsteps of a girl carrying a suitcase too big for her heart, walking into the life of a geisha. Let me know when you're ready to continue with part 2. The mornings at the Okiya began before the world stirred. The sun had not yet graced the tiled rooftops of John when I was gently shaken awake by a soft tap on the shoulder. My senior, whose name was Mariko, always moved like a whisper, her footsteps never betraying the weight of her presence. She was 18, already a Maiko, an apprentice geisha, with lips painted red like plum blossoms and eyes that never lingered too long. The first week was hardest. My body, still used to sleeping under the lazy rhythm of the sea breeze, rebelled against the rigid timing of the house. I fumbled with the futon, often folding it unevenly. I tripped over the wooden sandals, geta, that lined the threshold. I forgot to bow deep enough, to speak softly enough, to walk slowly enough. Every mistake was met with correction, not harsh, but firm. There was no room for softness in training. Okasan rarely raised her voice, but her silence, when it came, weighed more than scolding. She observed everything, from the way we held our chopsticks, to how we placed our hands when greeting a guest, to the angle of our bows. She did not teach through affection. She taught through standards. It was only later that I would understand. To serve beauty, you must first become its disciple. The Okiya housed 4 of us, myself, Mariko, and 2 other girls my age. One was named Aika. She had dimples and a curious tilt to her smile, as though every word she spoke was part of a secret. The other was Sumire, quieter than the rest, with long fingers and a dancer's poise even before training began. We were all different, but bound by the same fate, to be molded. Our days were carved into strict rituals. At 6, we scrubbed the wooden corridors of the house with rags soaked in cold water. No brooms, no complaints. The act was meant to humble us, to remind us that elegance is built on discipline. Afterward came breakfast, simple rice, miso soup, and pickled vegetables. Talking was minimal, and only when necessary. Then came the lessons. We were escorted single file to the school by an older attendant. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary house, but inside, it was a world steeped in centuries of culture. We learned how to play the shamisen, how to pour tea with grace, how to carry ourselves with stillness. The art of the geisha, I soon realized, was not in seduction, but in control. Dance was the most difficult. The fan in my hand felt unnatural at first, and my steps clumsy. I could feel the instructors watching me, eyes like measuring tapes. Every gesture had weight. Every motion told a story. To raise your sleeve too high, to blink too quickly, these were betrayals of the narrative. We learned to carry emotion not on our faces, but in our fingers, our breaths, the tilt of our necks. I often returned to the Okiya with aching feet and sore knees. But I never cried, not after that first night. There was no time for tears, only practice. One evening, after a long day of rehearsal, Mariko invited me to sit with her on the engawa, the narrow wooden balcony that looked out into the small garden. The stones were still wet from the afternoon rain, and the cicadas sang low in the hedges. "You're stiff when you move," she said, her voice gentle, not cruel. "But your eyes are soft. That's rare." I looked down, unsure if that was praise or pity. "You'll learn," she continued. "Just remember, a geisha is not a mask. She is a mirror. Guests see themselves in us, so we must always be polished." I didn't understand all of what she meant at the time, but I held on to those words because they were the first kindness I'd been given since arriving. As the months went by, the routines began to settle in my bones. The strange became familiar. I no longer stumbled while walking in Okobo, the tall wooden sandals worn by Maiko. I learned to kneel for hours without shifting. I could brew the perfect bowl of matcha without spilling a single drop. But beneath all of it, I missed home. In rare moments, when I was left alone to scrub the ingawa or fold the linens, I would think of Haruki. I wondered if he still played in the hills, if he still scratched his name into the bark of trees. I imagined Momo curled up in my mother's lap, and whether my mother still hummed lullabies to herself while stitching late at night. One day, Okazan summoned me to her room. It was a rare occurrence. Her chamber smelled of sandalwood and tea, and the floor was covered in layered silk rugs. She sat behind a low writing desk, brushing ink onto paper. "You've made progress," she said without looking up. I bowed low, waiting. "We will begin your transformation." My breath caught. I had heard whispers of this day from Aika and Sumire, who had yet to receive such news. Transformation meant I would become a Minarai, a pre-Maiko. It was the first visible step toward becoming a full geisha. It meant makeup. It meant kimono. It meant stepping out into the world. That week, the house stirred with preparation. An elder came to apply the white oshiroi base to my face. My lips were painted in the iconic red, though only the lower lip was filled, a mark of my status. My hair was shaped into a traditional wear-shinobu style, adorned with pins that shimmered with every step. When I finally looked into the mirror, I did not recognize the girl who stared back. She looked older, still, like porcelain, but behind her eyes was the same fear, the same ache for something far away. Mariko entered the room, nodding in approval. "You look like one of us now," she said. But I didn't feel like one of them. Not yet. That night, I stood by the window of my room, peering out at the alley below. The lantern swayed softly in the breeze, casting patterns on the cobblestone. Somewhere in the distance, a shamisen played a slow, aching melody. I rested my cheek against the cool wood of the frame and closed my eyes. Transformation, I learned that night, was not about changing what you are. It was about burying it deep enough that even you might forget. As Minarai, we were ghosts on the threshold, present, but not yet whole. We followed our seniors to Ochaya, the tea houses, where Kyoto's elite gathered for nights of quiet indulgence. We did not speak unless spoken to. We did not perform. We were there to observe, to learn, to listen. Our purpose was to be seen, but not remembered. It was a strange limbo, adorned in silk, faces painted like spring dolls, and yet still considered too green to step into the full light of the floating world. The first time I entered an Ochaya, the scent of cedarwood and warm sake wrapped around me like a fog. The room was aglow with soft lamplight, the walls lined with paintings of cranes and plum blossoms. I followed behind Mariko, steps precise, hands folded in front of me, eyes cast just low enough to be polite, but not low enough to seem timid. Our guest was a middle-aged merchant with tired eyes and a laugh that came too easily. His hair was slicked back with camellia oil, and his silk haori bore a faint crest over the shoulder. He did not glance at me. His attention rested squarely on Mariko, who poured his sake with the grace of a falling petal. "Your sleeves are still too stiff," she whispered to me later, behind the folding screen as we prepared to leave. "Let the fabric flow with your arms, not against them." I nodded, swallowing the sting of disappointment. That was how it was. Every movement was an opportunity for criticism. Every silence, a moment to read between lines. We were told to watch, to memorize gestures, how Mariko's smile lingered just long enough to be charming, never coy, how she laughed lightly at jokes she'd surely heard 100 times, how she never let a guest pour his own drink, no matter how often he reached for the bottle. There was no written manual for these lessons, only repetition, observation, and time. Back at the Okia, our days remained steeped in study. The instructors grew sterner, more exacting. I found a particular affinity for the shamisen, my fingers developing small calluses that made the plucking feel less foreign. The music became a kind of escape, a world where I could shape beauty with sound rather than silence. Sometimes in the quiet of late night, I would sneak into the practice room, sit cross-legged in the corner, and play fragments of melodies too soft to echo down the halls. Aika, meanwhile, grew into her role with ease. Her charm was effortless, her smile instinctive. Guests remembered her, even when they weren't supposed to. Sumire moved like water, her dance so fluid and measured that instructors sometimes paused mid-lesson just to watch her. I admired them both, and I wondered what I was. if I was anything at all. One evening, after returning from a particularly crowded Ochaya, I lingered on the Ngawa again. The spring wind was crisp, carrying the scent of early sakura blossoms. Mariko sat beside me, the hem of her kimono brushing against the edge of the wooden floor. "You were better tonight," she said softly. "I spilled the tea," I whispered. "Yes," she said, "but you caught it before anyone noticed. That's better." We sat in silence for a while. The garden beyond the veranda was a moonlit tapestry of moss and stone. Somewhere in the distance a frog croaked once and fell quiet. "Do you miss it?" I asked her. "Before this life?" Mariko didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was distant, fixed on something unseen. "I used to dance in the fields," she said at last. "Before I knew what a geisha was, I thought that would be my life, spinning in the tall grass until I fell down laughing." I imagined her younger, barefoot and free, hair wild in the wind. And then I imagined her now, poised, composed, perfectly measured. "And now?" I asked. "Now I spin for others, and I don't fall down." I didn't sleep much that night. The walls of the Okia held stillness like a second skin. I lay beneath my futon, listening to the creaks of the old beams, the occasional rustle of silk in the rooms beside mine, and the whisper of the wind sliding under the eaves. I thought about dancing in fields, about tea stains and painted smiles, and about the soft ache in my chest that wouldn't leave. Weeks passed, and my debut as a full Maiko approached. Okasan began discussing kimono choices, hair ornamentation, and even the names of patrons who might attend. There was excitement in the air, but I felt a strange hollowness. I should have been proud. This was the path I had been chosen for, had sacrificed for. And yet, on the morning of my formal debut, known as Misadashi, I was awoken before the first bell. The house stirred with anticipation. Attendants bustled quietly, laying out the layers of kimono, each more vivid than the last. My obi, the broad sash tied around my waist, was embroidered with golden cranes in flight. My hair, now done in a more elaborate style, ached from the weight of the pins and combs. When the preparations were complete, I stood in front of the long mirror in the hall. Aika and Sumire flanked me, their expressions a mixture of awe and jealousy. Mariko stood behind us, silent. "You are now part of the night," Okasan said as she passed by. "Walk slowly. Let the world catch up to you." I stepped outside with my attendant, the morning light casting a glow over Gion's narrow streets. People paused as we passed, bowing slightly. Shopkeepers came to their doors. I was no longer invisible. My face had become a mask of tradition, my body a vessel of grace. And still, beneath the lacquer and layers, I was just a girl. We visited shrines, paid respects, greeted patrons and elders. The hours passed like a dream, and I moved as I had been taught, slowly, deliberately, without falter. But inside, my heart beat too quickly. My thoughts raced. That evening, when I finally returned to the Okia, exhausted and sore, I removed the kimono layer by layer. Each fold felt like shedding a skin. I sat at my mirror, wiping away the thick white paint, revealing my face inch by inch. And when I was bare again, I looked into my own eyes and asked quietly, "Who am I now?" The reflection didn't answer, but it blinked, slowly, softly, and held my gaze just long enough to make me wonder if I had become a mirror too. The first month as a full-fledged Maiko was like stepping into a carefully painted scroll, the world unfurling in rich, intricate strokes around me. Days and nights blended into a series of ceremonies, rehearsals, and engagements, each more exacting than the last. My name was spoken with curiosity in the Ochaya, guests leaning in to get a better glimpse at the new bloom in Gion. They always looked a little longer at the debutantes, perhaps trying to catch the last glimmer of youth before it hardened into elegance. The Ochaya became a stage, and I, a performer who could never leave the wings. Every night I was adorned in my finest kimono, hair gleaming with oil and ornaments that clicked softly when I turned my head. My face was painted to stillness, my smile carefully balanced between sweetness and detachment. We entered rooms heavy with incense and the low murmur of conversation. I danced when asked. I poured sake without spilling. I laughed when the mood called for it, and said little unless prompted. There were favorites among the guests, those who came more often, whose preferences we were taught to memorize. One liked his tea just a little cooler than usual. Another hated perfumed sleeves. One man insisted we call him sensei, though he was no teacher. They all smiled, all told stories. Some watched us with tender nostalgia, others with desire barely hidden behind politeness. But all came for the same thing, a reflection of what they wanted to see. Mariko once told me, as we were fixing our sashes before entering a banquet, no one falls in love with a geisha. They fall in love with the idea of her. I remember that every time a guest's eyes lingered too long, it was easier that way. In private, though, we were girls again. After a long evening, when the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, we would gather in the back room where our laughter no longer had to be polite. Aika would undo her obi and fall backward with a groan, sighing dramatically about her aching feet. Sumire would quietly massage her shoulders, always graceful, even in exhaustion. I would sit cross-legged, peeling the white paint from my chin with gentle swipes, marveling at how easily it came away. I wish I could sleep with my face still on, Aika joked one night. Then maybe I'd dream I was beautiful. You're beautiful without it, Sumire said softly. We all fell quiet after that. There were moments of joy, hidden like pearls beneath the surface. When we danced in perfect harmony during a rehearsal, or when a guest praised our performance with genuine warmth. There were secret exchanges with the kitchen staff, who snuck us sweet mochi when Okasan wasn't looking. And there were stolen moments on the Ingawa, under the pale moon, when I allowed myself to breathe like a girl again. Not a symbol. Yet the strain slowly etched itself into my being. My body grew leaner, tougher. My knees bore the marks of endless hours in Seiza. My voice, once soft and light, learned to carry tones of courtesy and command. I began to understand the invisible hierarchy that governed the world of the Hanamachi. The Okiya was not a family, it was a vessel. And I was cargo meant to be refined, displayed, and traded in moments of time and beauty. One afternoon, Okasan summoned me into her chambers. I bowed, knees on the tatami, spine straight, heart thudding. There is a guest, she said, looking over her glasses. He has requested you, alone. I felt a ripple of surprise. That is not common, I said. No, she replied. But he is a patron with old ties, and he has taken interest. The following evening, I dressed with care beyond routine. My kimono was the deep blue of twilight, embroidered with waves and flying cranes. My kanzashi glinted in my hair like stars. My lips were painted fully now, no longer the half smile of a novice. I was no longer becoming, I had become. The ochaya was quieter than usual. Only one table was set, and the attendant bowed more deeply than I'd ever seen. The guest was already seated when I entered. He was not what I expected. Not old, not adorned in luxury. His hair was dusted with silver, though his face was younger than his eyes. He wore a simple jacket, and his hands clasped in front of him bore the faint calluses of someone who had known work. Thank you for coming, he said. His voice was familiar. I bowed. The honor is mine. As I knelt and began the ritual of pouring his sake, my fingers trembled slightly. He noticed but said nothing. I heard your debut was elegant, he said. The whole district was talking. You are kind to say so. He smiled gently. I remember when you were chasing fireflies by the sea. I froze. My hand tightened around the sake bottle, and I looked up. It was Haruki. Older now, broader in the shoulders, but unmistakably him. The tilt of his mouth, the warmth in his gaze. The boy who once dared me leap from the tallest rock into the sea. The boy I had left behind. I heard a rumor, he said, voice low, that a girl from my village had become a Maiko in Gion. Took me a long time to believe it. I didn't speak. My throat tightened around the words. I'm just visiting, he added, passing through on business, but I had to see for myself. What did you see? I whispered. He looked at me, really looked, not the way the guests looked, not with hunger or curiosity, but with recognition and grief. I see her, he said, somewhere in there. The room held its breath. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. The pain on my face forbade it. The training in my body forbade it. But inside, something stirred, something soft, something dangerous. When our time was up, he stood and bowed. You were always meant for more, he said quietly. Then he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor like a retreating tide. That night, I washed my face more slowly than usual. The white paint swirled down the basin like mist dissolving. I stared into the mirror, waiting to see if the girl he spoke of would look back. But she didn't. Only I remained, painted, perfect, hollow. The days following Haruki's visit unfolded like silk unraveling, quiet, smooth, and unending. Yet beneath their softness, something had shifted. I could feel it in the stillness between steps, in the silence after laughter. His words echoed in places I had long sealed away, dusting off memories I had buried beneath layers of white powder and embroidered silk. I didn't tell anyone he had come. Not Aika, not Sumire, not even Mariko. There was no rule against it. But some moments are too fragile to survive being spoken aloud. Like a snowflake caught on the tip of your finger, beautiful until touched. Instead, I let my days swallow me again. Our routines remained exacting. At dawn, we rose to prepare. We rehearsed in the studio with aching limbs and learned new dances designed to express the fleeting beauty of nature, the falling leaf, the opening flower, the passing cloud. Everything ephemeral, everything just out of reach. In the evenings, we moved from Ochaya to Ochaya, floating through the night in a blur of music, tea, and conversation. Some guests were new, eager to impress, to be seen in the presence of Geisha. Others were old hands, more interested in the quiet comfort of familiarity than novelty. With each, I became what they wanted: a mirror, a dream, a sliver of the past they could sip like warm sake. But I carried Haruki's gaze with me. It stayed with me as I bowed, as I smiled, as I performed. Not as a burden, but as a question. Was there truly a girl still living within this carefully constructed shell? One evening, after a long engagement, I returned to the Okiya alone. The others had gone to a second party, but I had been given leave to rest. My feet throbbed with exhaustion, and my shoulders were tight from hours of holding poise. I stepped into the garden behind the house, drawn by the hush of leaves in the wind and the scent of moss after rain. The garden was small, enclosed by wooden walls and shaded by a maple tree that had just begun to blush with early autumn. I knelt on the stone bench beside the koi pond and exhaled deeply. In the moonlight, the surface of the water shimmered like silk, and the fish moved slowly beneath it, their colors dulled by shadow. I closed my eyes. I let the mask slip just for a moment. In the stillness, I remembered. I remembered the way the sea air used to smell in the morning, the way my father's hands looked when they pulled in nets, how my mother's hair came loose when she bent over her sewing. I remembered Momo curling in the crook of my arm, Haruki's laughter echoing through the trees. I remembered the cliff where we stood and dared the wind to knock us over. I remembered who I was before I was polished, before I was painted, before I was beautiful. That night, I dreamed. In the dream, I was dancing, not in a tea house, not on a stage, but barefoot in a field of long grass. My kimono trailed behind me, but my feet were light, free. The wind caught my sleeves like wings, and I spun, laughing, until the stars blurred above me. And there at the edge of the field stood Haruki, his hands in his pockets, watching without speaking. When I awoke, tears had dried on my cheeks. I did not cry easily, not anymore. But the dream had peeled back a layer I hadn't realized still existed. Something soft, something vulnerable. That day, during our morning practice, I moved differently. My dance teacher, Madame Kade, noticed first. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a voice like a plucked string. Delicate, but impossible to ignore. Again, she said as I finished the sequence. I bowed, heart racing, and began the dance once more. It was an old one, meant to evoke the sorrow of a woman waiting for a lover who never returns. I had performed it before, many times, but today it lived differently in my limbs. My fingers trembled as I reached out to empty space. My steps lingered longer between beats. My breath caught on imagined memories. When I finished, silence filled the room. Madame Kade nodded slowly. That, she said, was grief. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, something began to change in how others looked at me. Guests lingered longer in conversation. They requested my presence more often. Okasan watched me with a new kind of scrutiny, as though trying to understand what had shifted beneath the surface. But it wasn't something that could be named. It was simply that, for the first time, I danced not just as a geisha, but as a person, and people felt it. Mariko noticed too. One night, as we removed our makeup side by side, she glanced at me in the mirror. You've become more present, she said. I met her eyes. Present? She nodded. Before, you were perfect, but you were always elsewhere. Now you're here, in the room, even when you're silent. I thought of Haruki, of how he had looked at me that night, not through me, but into me. And I wondered, had I allowed a crack to form? In the world of the geisha, cracks were dangerous. Cracks let in the light, but they also let things out. Still, I couldn't go back to how I was before. Not entirely. The shift had happened. Quietly, irreversibly. The girl I had been before, Jion. She was no longer buried. She was waking up slowly, like something thawing under spring sunlight. And though I moved through the same rituals, wore the same paint, spoke the same words, I knew. Something inside me had begun to stir, and it would not sleep again. The lanterns in Jion changed with the seasons. In spring, they bore the image of plum blossoms. In summer, dragonflies hovered in delicate brushstrokes. As autumn deepened, the lanterns outside the okaya glowed with the fiery shapes of maple leaves, their soft light flickering like memory on the edge of flame. It was during this amber-washed season that I first performed kurokami, a dance of black hair, of longing, of waiting. It was one of the oldest dances and one of the most intimate. A woman in solitude, combing her hair in the night, haunted by absence. The audience often mistook its softness for simplicity. But to dance kurokami properly required more than precision. It demanded stillness, restraint, and a rawness beneath the calm. It was the first time I had been asked to perform it solo. My instructor prepared me in silence. There were no corrections, no last-minute notes. She simply adjusted the angle of my fan and said, "You are ready." On the night of the performance, the ochaya was hushed. A private event, just 6 guests, all seated in a perfect arc across the tatami. I could hear the clink of porcelain cups, the faint laughter behind folding fans. My name was announced, and then the shamisen began. I entered the room with deliberate slowness, sleeves trailing like breath. My feet knew the rhythm before the melody even began. As I moved, I let myself feel not the steps, but the weight of silence, the ache of memory. I saw the image in my mind, a woman kneeling alone, brushing her hair with long, aching strokes as the hours slipped by. A woman who no longer waited for the sound of footsteps, but remembered them anyway. When the dance ended, there was a silence longer than applause, the kind of stillness that wrapped around you like cloth. Later, as the guests were leaving, one approached me, an older man with eyes that had seen many years of such performances. "Your dance," he said, "was like reading a letter never meant to be sent." I bowed, my heart beating louder than the shamisen ever could. After the guests had gone and the night had stilled, I sat alone in the changing room, my makeup half removed, my hair loose from its ornaments. My reflection in the mirror was bare. No longer the geisha, no longer the girl, but something in between, a woman who had learned to hold grief like a fan, gracefully, without letting it slip. That same week, Okasan informed me that I had been requested by name for a special engagement. A patron from Tokyo, a rare visitor, was in town, and his host had specifically asked for me. It was an honor, one I had not yet expected. But with honor came danger. "He is a man of influence," Okasan said. "Be careful, but be gracious." The night of the engagement, I dressed with particular attention. My kimono was deep violet, patterned with cascading chrysanthemums. I chose simpler hair ornaments, refined, not ostentatious. When I arrived at the okaya, the room was already warm with conversation. Men in silk haori, their voices low and measured, sat sipping sake from lacquered cups. The host introduced me. The guest from Tokyo was tall, with sharp cheekbones and narrow eyes that missed nothing. His kimono was understated, but his posture betrayed status. He was not loud, nor arrogant, but there was an edge to his presence, a quiet assertion of control. He watched me carefully as I poured his drink, as I made polite conversation. He asked about Kyoto, about dance, about the history of the Hanamachi. His questions were intelligent, too intelligent. They weren't about me, not really. They were about what I represented. "You're young," he said finally, "but you carry age in your voice." I smiled politely. "Perhaps I am old in spirit." He studied me. "No, I think you've just seen too much beauty too soon. It always leaves a shadow." I did not reply. The evening ended without incident. I performed a short dance, answered a few more questions, and took my leave with the usual bows. But as I walked home through the quiet streets of Gion, his words clung to me. Too much beauty, too soon. It was true in a way. I had spent the last few years submerged in aesthetics, in color, movement, grace. I had studied beauty, imitated it, embodied it. But beauty, I had come to realize, was a kind of weight. It demanded attention. It required distance. You could never possess it and be seen as human at the same time. Back at the Okia, I found Ika sitting in the kitchen sipping tea. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. "Tough night?" I asked. She nodded. "He cried, right in the middle of his story. I didn't know what to do." "Did you console him?" She shrugged. "I poured more sake. That's all they really want anyway." I sat beside her and poured myself a cup. We drank in silence. "Do you think we'll do this forever?" she asked suddenly. The question lingered in the warm air. "I don't know," I said. "Sometimes," she whispered, "I miss who I was before I learned how to smile without feeling it." I reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, even in the heat of the kitchen. "Me too," I said. We didn't speak further. That night, I returned to my room and unrolled a blank sheet of paper. I had not written in years, not letters, not poems, not even thoughts, but something in me needed release. I picked up the brush and dipped it into ink. I did not write words. I painted. A wave, a lantern, a girl standing in a garden, her back to the viewer, and above her, falling like snow, strands of black hair. Autumn surrendered to winter in a hush. Jian became quieter, softened beneath the weight of frost. The lanterns no longer danced in the breeze. They stood solemn and still, their painted patterns dulled by the breath of snow. The okchaya felt colder too, though we never acknowledged it aloud. Our sleeves grew longer, our movements more deliberate, conserving warmth where we could. The scent of incense seemed sharper in the cold, curling through the rooms like threads of memory. With winter came a slowing of the calendar. Fewer guests, shorter engagements. Even the air outside moved slower, and in this stillness, we were left more often with ourselves. Ika began to grow restless. She would pace the Ngawa at night, wrapped in her shawl, her breath blooming white in the air. She spoke less during rehearsals, her laughter thinner than before. One morning, as we folded linens in the back room, she turned to me suddenly and asked, "Do you ever dream of forgetting?" "Forgetting what?" I asked. "This," she said, gesturing around her, at the neatly pressed towels, the lacquered trays stacked on the shelf, the scent of rice vinegar still clinging to the air. "All of this." I didn't answer, because I knew that dream. But I also knew what forgetting would cost. Instead of replying, I reached for another towel and folded it with precise corners. Ika didn't speak again. That same week, we were summoned to prepare for the New Year's performance at Yasaka Shrine. It was one of the rare times when Geisha performed in public, not just for patrons, but for the city. The district took it seriously. Every movement had to be flawless, every detail perfect. We began rehearsing Manzai, a celebratory dance meant to honor longevity, joy, and renewal. It was fast, intricate, filled with turns and claps and sudden pauses that demanded razor precision, a celebration on the surface, but beneath it, a quiet discipline. Mariko was assigned to lead as the senior, and I was to take second position. It was an honor, one not offered lightly. "Your tempo is too soft," Madame Kade told me on the second day. "This is not a dream, it is a festival. Bring light to your steps." I nodded and repeated the sequence, each morning blurred into rehearsal. Our bodies ached, our fingers raw from the cold, but slowly, the dance began to take shape. Our feet tapped in unison, our sleeves swirled like winter birds in flight. Our claps echoed sharp in the silence of the studio. On the seventh day, Okasan came to observe. She sat silently in the corner, folding her hands neatly over her knees. She said nothing as we danced, no nods, no expressions, only stillness. After we finished, sweat cooling against our backs, she stood. "You are ready," she said, and that was all. The morning of the performance arrived with a light snowfall. The streets of Jian were dusted with white, the rooftops brushed in powder like confections. We dressed in our most formal attire, layered kimono, embroidered with cranes and pine trees, symbols of the new year. Our makeup was flawless, our lips blood red against the pale winter light. The shrine was already filled with townspeople when we arrived. Children perched on shoulders, merchants in their best robes, old women leaning on canes to glimpse the dancers. It was strange, performing not for the elite, but for the people. For those who did not sip aged sake or debate poetry, but who watched with eyes full of wonder, not expectation. As the music began, I felt my nerves rise. Not from fear, but from something deeper, a hope that we might offer them something pure, something untarnished by ritual or politics. Just a moment of beauty. We danced in perfect unison. The claps rang out like firecrackers. Our feet moved across the stage with rhythmic certainty. I could feel the warmth of the crowd's attention, the way they leaned in as one. When we struck the final pose, arms outstretched, fans open like wings, the applause came, not thunderous, but sincere, lasting. And then, as tradition demanded, we bowed. Afterward, as we stood backstage, catching our breath, Okasan approached us. She looked at each of us in turn, her gaze lingering on me longer than the others. "Tonight, you were not performing," she said. "You were giving." It was the closest she had ever come to praise. That night, the Okiya was unusually quiet. Aika retired early and Sumire sat alone by the garden, eyes closed, letting the snow fall into her lap without brushing it away. I wandered to the practice room, still dressed in my formal kimono, and sat at the edge of the tatami. There I saw it, my painting. I had left it tucked beneath a shelf weeks ago, unsure if I would ever finish it. Someone had placed it on the stand, unrolled and exposed, a quiet wave, a lantern, a girl beneath falling strands of black hair. And beside it, something new, a poem, written in neat brushstrokes. The wave forgets the shore it touches, but the shore remembers every tide. The ink was fresh. I knew at once it had been Mariko. She had seen my painting, she had understood, and she had responded not with questions, but with verse. I sat there for a long time, staring at the poem, the brush still in my hand. We did not often speak our truths aloud in the Okiya, but sometimes in the spaces between art and silence, we found one another. Winter deepened. The snow thickened over the tiled rooftops of Gion, muffling the sounds of footsteps and closing the streets into quiet, silver corridors. We learned to move through the cold with grace, careful not to let our teeth chatter when bowing to guests, hiding trembling fingers in our sleeves, sipping warm tea in small, polite sips. The world outside grew sharper, starker, while inside the Okiya, everything became hushed and inward. With the new year passing, a strange lull settled over the house. Our calendar thinned. Engagements came slower with longer spaces between. The older patrons were away for the winter, visiting warmer regions or staying behind closed doors. And so, for the first time in many months, we were left with time. Time is a dangerous luxury in the world of the geisha. It leaves room for thought. And thoughts, left unguarded, begin to thaw what we have spent years freezing. One late morning, I awoke to find Mariko already dressed, sitting at the edge of her futon. The faint scent of camellia oil lingered in the air. She had done her hair early, though there were no appointments that day. "Where are you going?" I asked, voice still thick with sleep. She glanced at me through the mirror. "To see someone." It wasn't unusual. Senior geisha often visited trusted patrons or old friends outside of formal engagements. But there was something in her tone that gave me pause, something careful, measured. "Will you be back for supper?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Maybe." She left without another word, her figure disappearing behind the sliding door like a shadow drawn away by wind. I didn't see her again that night. The next morning, the house was quiet. Sumire was in the garden feeding the koi, her breath visible in the chill. Aika had gone back to bed with a headache. I waited through breakfast, through cleaning, through rehearsal, expecting Mariko's soft steps, her brief nod as she passed through the halls. But she never came. By evening, Okasan gathered us in the main room. "She has chosen to leave," she said. No one spoke. "She left a letter, she thanked us, but her path leads elsewhere now." Sumire's fingers went still in her lap. Aika closed her eyes. I stared at the floor. "She left quietly," Okasan continued. "That is her right, but her absence will be felt." And then she stood, and the meeting was over. Back in our rooms, silence settled like snow. Aika wept for a while, face buried in her sleeves. Sumire lit a stick of incense and prayed. I sat before my mirror and stared at my reflection, unable to recognize the calm in my own eyes. Mariko had been the first to speak to me when I arrived. She had fixed my collar when I didn't know how to fold it. She had shared tea with me on the Engawa, told me stories about the guests, helped me learn the rhythms of the Okiya. She was never warm, not openly, but she had been constant, quiet, present, and now she was gone. That night, I found the poem again beside the painting. The ink had faded just slightly, the paper beginning to curl at the edges. I traced the characters with my fingertip, wondering if Mariko had written more somewhere else, words I would never see, thoughts meant only for herself. We never asked why a geisha left. Some did it for love. Others, for family. Some simply reached the edge of what they could carry and chose to let it all fall. But whatever her reason, Mariko had slipped away like the winter moon, full and distant, visible only for a while, then vanished. In the days that followed, we adjusted. Our schedules were rearranged, roles shifted. Sumire stepped into Mariko's place during rehearsals, her movements precise, almost reverent. Aika spoke more softly, as if afraid to disturb something fragile in the air. And I felt the hollow left behind like a shadow beside my own. One evening, while returning from a modest engagement with a merchant and his wife, I passed by a small stationery shop tucked between two alleyways. Something drew me in, not the display of fine brushes or parchment, but the quiet light spilling from the doorway. Inside, the owner greeted me with a bow and said nothing more. I wandered slowly, fingers brushing along the shelves, until I came to a tray of small journals. Handmade, their covers were stitched in silk, the edges of each page dipped in gold. I purchased one without knowing why. Back at the Okiya, I opened to the first page and stared at the emptiness. Then I wrote, Mariko left during the snow. She did not say goodbye, but her presence lingers like perfume on the sleeve. I do not blame her. The path is long, and no one walks it forever. I closed the book and hid it beneath my futon. Writing felt dangerous, but it also felt necessary. Winter teaches you that stillness can hold entire storms, and inside me I could feel one beginning to form. The weeks after Mariko's departure carried an unfamiliar weight, as if the walls of the Okiya had lost a subtle part of their rhythm. Everything still functioned, still moved in its elegant procession. Breakfasts were served on time, tea was brewed with practiced hands, the guests still came and went, but her absence was a hollow note that played beneath every sound. I resumed my duties with more diligence than ever. Rehearsals filled my mornings, and engagements, though sparser in the cold months, still pulled us into the flickering warmth of Ochaya parlors. I took Sumire's lead during dances now, no longer shadowing Mariko. It was expected of me. And I performed well, perhaps too well. Compliments became frequent. Guests requested my presence by name. Even Okasan allowed herself a few rare nods of approval. But I could feel something tightening within me. Not pressure, not fear, loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the quiet ache of being surrounded by people who only knew the version of you you'd built for them. The version crafted from centuries of expectation. One night after a solo performance, I lingered longer than I should have in the changing room. The guests had already departed. The attendants had cleaned up and returned to the kitchen. The Ochaya had begun to dim its lanterns. I sat on the tatami, slowly removing my kanzashi pins one by one, placing each into their velvet-lined box. The room was still, the hum of laughter from earlier replaced by the rustle of paper walls settling in the winter chill. A faint knock on the sliding door interrupted my solitude. It opened a crack. A woman in a pale gray kimono stepped inside, bowing slightly. She was not from our Okiya. Her face was bare of makeup, but something about the way she moved betrayed years of training. Smooth, measured, effortless. Her eyes held the weariness of someone who had watched too many seasons pass in silence. Forgive the intrusion, she said. I used to perform here. I asked if I could see the room again. I bowed. Of course. She stood in silence, scanning the room. Her gaze paused on the mirror, then on the lacquered drawers, and finally on me. I was told you danced Kurokami here, she said. I did, I replied. They said it was unforgettable. I said nothing. Praise was something we were taught to accept quietly. She stepped closer and crouched beside me, her knees creaking faintly. I danced that same piece here, almost 20 years ago, she said. The first time I felt seen. Her words fell softly, but they carried weight. I don't remember their faces, she continued. The guests, the patrons, but I remember the silence after the music stopped. It was the only time I ever felt like I had spoken. We sat together in the hush of the room, two women from different ends of the same path. Did you leave? I asked, softly. She smiled faintly. Eventually, but I never really escaped. The world outside expects less, but gives less too. At least here, we are wrapped in purpose. She stood, brushing off her knees. But remember, grace should not become armor. Even flowers lean toward the sun. And with that, she bowed again and slipped out of the room. I sat there long after she'd gone, her words sinking slowly into me. That night, I wrote again in the journal beneath my futon. She said I danced like someone remembering a life not yet lived. I wonder if I'm dancing towards something or away, perhaps both. I do not know if the petals that fall are dying or simply letting go. The next morning brought snow. It came not as a storm, but as a quiet veil, blanketing the alleyways, turning rooftops into frosted sculptures. The city slowed, even the laughter of children muffled by the softness underfoot. Okasan canceled our engagements for the day. Sumire sat by the window, watching the snow fall with that same stillness she carried in every movement. Aika practiced shamisen in the parlor, the notes uneven, tired. I went to the garden, wrapped in a wool shawl, and cleared a small path through the snow with a broom. Beneath the white, the stone lantern still stood. Weathered, solid. A single leaf, long dead, clung to its base. I thought of Murako, of the woman in gray, of the way silence could become a voice if you learned how to listen. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I would stay here forever. The thought frightened me, not because I feared the life of a geisha, but because for so long, I had not allowed myself to imagine anything else. That night, I performed for a small gathering, a single guest, a foreign scholar with kind eyes and a translator who spoke only when needed. He asked careful questions, offered thoughtful compliments, and listened as I played the shamisen, his head tilted just so, as if hearing not the music, but the space between the notes. When I bowed to leave, he placed his cup down and said through the translator, "You carry many seasons in your eyes. I wonder which one you belong to." I smiled, not answering. But the question followed me home, like a snowflake caught in my sleeve, melting slowly against my skin. The snow lingered longer than usual that year, as if winter itself had grown sentimental. Gion, under its blanket of white, looked like a painting half finished, muted colors beneath soft outlines, quiet corners suspended in time. There was a beauty to it, yes, but also a sadness, as though the season was holding its breath, waiting for something it couldn't name. Inside the okiya, the heat from the hearth became our gathering place. In the early mornings and late evenings, we would sit around it, sleeves tucked, sipping barley tea and listening to the wood crackle softly. The rhythm of our lives had slowed, and with it, our voices became quieter, our gestures more intimate. Sumire had begun practicing a solo for an upcoming tea ceremony. It was a dance of spring, despite the snow outside. Watching her rehearse each day, moving like thawing water, like the whisper of buds beneath frozen earth, was a reminder that seasons were more than weather. They were moods, temptations, promises. One morning as she moved through the sequence, Okasan entered the room with an unfamiliar look on her face. Not stern, not disapproving, something closer to concern. She called my name. I rose from my place and followed her down the corridor, my heart quickening in the stillness. We entered the tea room, where she motioned for me to kneel across from her. A pot of green tea sat between us, steam curling upward in delicate threads. She poured the tea herself, a gesture that startled me. Okasan rarely served. She expected others to serve her. "You've become noted," she said after a pause. I bowed slightly. "I try to honor the okiya." "That is not what I mean," she said. "You've been requested for the spring gatherings, not just one or two, many, by name, some who've never requested anyone before." I kept my head bowed. "This can be good," she said slowly. "It raises the house's standing. It secures our future." There was a weight behind those words, a condition hidden in them. "But you must remember," she added, "attention is a flame, beautiful to hold, dangerous to chase." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood yet what she was asking of me. "You are no longer a girl behind a painted smile," she said. "You are becoming a figure, a name. Be careful not to let them write your story for you." Later, I returned to the garden. The snow had begun to melt, puddling along the stones, revealing the dark soil beneath. I thought of the requests, the names of men I had never met but who had heard of me, through whispers, through poems, through dances performed behind paper screens. They did not know my voice, only my image. I remembered Haruki and how he had once said, "I see her somewhere in there." But I wondered now, was she still in there? Or had I stepped too far into the reflection, lost in the eyes of others? That night, I lit a candle beside my journal and wrote, "They see the petals but not the stem. They praise the bloom but forget the root. I have become their dream, but I still wake alone." The following week, I was invited to perform for a writer, a famous one. His books were praised for their insight into human nature, their melancholy, their precision. He was known to visit Gion rarely, and when he did, he spoke little, preferring to observe, to listen, to disappear. When I entered the Ochaya that evening, he was already seated, a cup of tea untouched before him. He looked older than I had expected, his hair thin, his frame slight, but his eyes were alive, piercing, curious. He bowed. I bowed. We spoke in the usual courtesies, weather, travel, the beauty of winter's final hush. But something about the rhythm felt different, less performative, more measured. He asked, "Do you enjoy dancing?" The question was so simple, so rarely asked, that I faltered. "I do," I said finally. "Why?" I looked at him, surprised. "Because," I said slowly, "it allows me to speak without revealing." He nodded, satisfied. "Then you are a writer," he said, "only with your body." I smiled at that, and for the first time in many performances, I felt something loosen in my chest. Later, after I danced a short piece from Fuji Musume, he clapped once and said, "You carried longing without ever asking for sympathy. That's rare." His words stayed with me long after the engagement ended. Back in my room, I wrote, "He saw the silence behind the movement." He did not ask for the story, only watched it unfold. It is rare to be seen without being claimed. That spring, my name traveled further. Invitations came from cities beyond Kyoto. There was talk of exhibitions, of private performances for foreign guests, of poetry collaborations. Okasan began speaking to me differently, with a softness, a calculation. I could sense she was preparing something, perhaps a new identity, a new version of me to shape and offer. But I had already begun creating my own. In the quiet hours of the night, I began writing poetry again, not for patrons, not for ceremonies, just for myself. Small haiku scribbled in the margins of my journal, snippets of dances never performed, stories never told aloud. And as the snow faded and the first cherry blossoms emerged, soft, tentative, trembling, I realized something. I was not only performing beauty, I was holding it. And within that, I was beginning, quietly, carefully, to shape my own voice. The first cherry blossoms of that year arrived like shy guests, peeking through the bare branches one petal at a time. In the alleyways of Gion, the air warmed by degrees, each breath carrying a trace of sweetness. The sharpness of winter softened into a velvet hush. Spring was always the most delicate of seasons, not bold like summer, not rich like autumn, but wistful, hesitant, as if unsure whether it had truly been invited. With the sakura came the hanami season, the flower viewing festivals that transformed Kyoto into a painting of soft pinks and fleeting joy. It was a sacred time for the geisha, a time of performance, of beauty, of being seen. Our bookings doubled, sometimes tripled. Guests traveled from afar to glimpse us under the falling blossoms, to sip sake beneath the trees while we danced to music that mirrored the petals, light, floating, ephemeral. We were told that during Hanami, we must become the blossoms ourselves, fragile, brief, unforgettable. It was on one of these nights, beneath a tree blooming full and luminous in the moonlight, that I was asked to perform a new piece. It had no name, only a melody. One composed by a shamisen player from Nara who rarely left his studio, but who had written the tune after dreaming of a woman he had loved long ago. The music was haunting, strange, rising and falling like breath caught between memory and silence. I listened to it once, and it wrapped around me like silk. The movement came slowly, arms unfolding like petals, steps drawn out like thoughts unspoken. I rehearsed it in secret, not because I was told to, but because I felt the need to. It was not the kind of piece that could be approached formally. It asked not for technique, but for surrender. When I finally performed it, it was not in a grand ochaya or at a bustling banquet. It was at a small gathering in Maruyama Park, beneath a wide cherry tree whose branches hung low like tired hands. The guests were few, an old woman with a paper fan, a young couple who held hands too tightly, a blind poet who requested only to sit and listen. A performance that, by traditional standards, would have been considered minor. But to me, it felt like something else entirely. As I danced, the petals fell steadily around me, clinging to my sleeves, to my hair. The music moved in slow waves, and I let myself be carried. I did not perform for the guests. I did not perform for the poet. I danced for the absence that lingers after love leaves, for the question left in a doorway long closed, for Mariko, who left in snow, for Haruki, who saw me through the mirror, and perhaps just a little for myself. When the final note hung in the air and I dropped into my closing pose, the only sound that followed was the rustle of petals landing softly on the tatami mat laid beneath me. No applause, only wind, only breath. Later, the blind poet approached me. His attendant guided his steps until he stood before me, head slightly bowed. He said, "I have never seen beauty, but I heard your sorrow." Then he reached into his sleeve and pulled out a slip of parchment. "I wrote this for someone I lost. I believe it belongs to you now." When I returned home, I opened it in the quiet of my room. The words, written in delicate brushstrokes, read, "She never said goodbye, but her silence in the wind was louder than spring." I folded the poem and placed it in the journal under my futon. Something inside me shifted that night. Not drastically, not like a stone falling, but like a thread pulling ever so slightly at the seam of a garment. I began to walk alone in the mornings before the sun rose fully, through alleys wet with dew, past shrines still wrapped in morning incense. I stopped by the river and watched the water move, always forward, always without hesitation. I began to write more, sometimes poetry, sometimes thoughts that didn't fit into poems, sometimes memories I thought I had forgotten, like the sound of my mother's voice as she called me home from the cliff's edge, like the way Haruki once placed a seashell in my palm and said, "Keep it, for when you need to hear the sea." Like the smell of salt and fish in the air after a storm. I wrote them all down not to remember but to preserve, because I knew my face would remain painted, my steps would remain measured, I would continue to dance, to bow, to serve. But somewhere beyond that ritual, I was becoming something else, not separate from the geisha, but deeper within her. A place not seen by guests or patrons or even Okasan. A room behind the mirror. A voice that was only beginning to speak. The blossoms fell faster as spring reached its height, the trees shedding their pale petals like sighs. For a few days, the streets of Jian were coated in soft pink drifts, piling gently along stone steps, caught in the corners of window frames, clinging to the hems of our kimono as we walked. Each step through them felt like moving through a memory, and then, just as quickly, they were gone. One morning, I stepped outside and found the last petal resting on the water basin near the gate. A single stroke of faded pink against gray stone. I watched it spin in the breeze, and then lift, vanish, as if it had never been there at all. The season had changed. With the passing of Hanami, the city exhaled. The tempo of our lives slowed just slightly, like the breath after a long performance. The ochaya grew quieter, the guests more subdued. Sake was poured more thoughtfully, laughter dipped into lower tones. These were the weeks between spectacle and summer, a pause, a hush. But inside the okiya, something stirred. Okasan had begun holding quiet meetings behind closed doors. Sumire had been asked to travel to Osaka for a special engagement. Aika received a letter from her family, and I saw her weep over it quietly one morning before hiding it away in the sleeve of her kimono. And me, I was summoned. Okasan's voice calling softly from her chambers. I entered as I always did, head bowed, steps precise, heart steady. She sat by the incense burner, the room perfumed with sandalwood, her robe lined in subdued plum silk. A stack of papers lay to one side, and a cup of untouched tea steamed faintly in the air between us. "You are ready," she said. I stayed silent, waiting. "There will be a formal proposal," she continued. "A patron has offered to become your Dana." The word rang through me like a bell dropped in deep water. Dana, a patron who provides for a geisha, not merely in money, but in presence, in permanence. It was the most traditional of arrangements and the most complex. Some Dana gave generously and expected nothing. Others gave in order to own. "He is from Tokyo," Okasan went on. "Wealthy, known, discreet. He saw your name on the registry during Hanami and made inquiries." I felt my hands fold more tightly into my lap. "This is not an order," she said, though her tone left little room for refusal. "But it is a path. It offers stability, prestige. And a name?" I asked. She looked at me sharply. "Do not pretend you are not already one." I bowed low and took my leave. That night, I lit the candle earlier than usual. The flame flickered unevenly, throwing shadows across the pages of my journal. I stared at the blank sheet for a long time before writing. They offer silver threads to stitch your name into silk. But names, once stitched, rarely change. I wonder if I am being chosen or if I'm being named. The next evening, I met him. We sat beneath the awning of a quiet okaya overlooking the river. The breeze stirred the lanterns just enough to keep them dancing. He arrived with little fanfare, no entourage, no scent of overconfidence. He was middle-aged, with a clean jawline and hair already graying at the temples. His eyes were calm, not sharp, not curious, but calm. He bowed politely and introduced himself as Yamamura. He did not speak of money, not of arrangements, not at first. Instead, he asked, "Do you still enjoy the dance?" I blinked. "It depends on the music," I said. He smiled. "Then we will speak as music." We talked that night for nearly an hour, not as geisha and patron, not as host and guest, but like two strangers caught in the same doorway watching the rain. He asked about my first performance. I asked him about his first failure. He told me about his mother's lacquer box, how it had cracked in the summer heat and still held the scent of jasmine decades later. I told him about the stray cat I once followed along the coast until night fell and I had to be carried home. He never once asked me to pour his drink. When the evening ended, he stood, bowed once again and said, "If you accept me, it will not be because I place you in a frame. It will be because I wish to sit beside the painting and look at it every day." I did not answer him then. Instead, I returned home and placed a clean sheet into my journal. This time, I wrote only one line. "Even mirrors deserve to be seen, not only used." The following morning, Okasan approached me. "He will wait for your answer," she said. And then she left. The weight of choice sat with me all day, through rehearsal, through the midday meal, through the evening preparations. It was not the weight of romance. There was no illusion of that. It was the weight of permanence. The knowledge that accepting Adana was not the end of my art, but it might be the end of my freedom to redefine it. A formal bond to a man was also a bond to a version of myself he would wish preserved. Could I endure that? Could I live as a portrait? Or had I already become one? I returned to the riverside alone at dusk. The blossoms were gone. The wind had changed. The water moved slowly, reflecting only the pale outline of the bridge above. I closed my eyes and listened. No music, no footsteps, only the sound of my own breath, rising, steady, and entirely mine. The decision lingered in the air for days, not like a storm waiting to break, but like a fog, thick, gentle, obscuring everything just enough to make each step feel uncertain. Okasa never pressed me. She didn't need to. Her silence alone was weight enough. And in the Okiya, silence was rarely empty. It was a language spoken in glances, in the cadence of footsteps, in the slight pause before a teacup met the table. Aika watched me differently, though she said nothing. Sumire continued as always, gliding through her days with quiet grace. But I noticed her stopping once at the edge of the garden, watching me longer than usual as I hung freshly washed linens in the wind. I knew what she was thinking, the same thing I was thinking. If I said yes, I would not leave the Okiya, but something inside me would. That week, I began performing Sagi Musume, the Heron Maiden. It was a dance of transformation and sorrow. A spirit, once a bird, that takes the form of a woman and falls in love with a human man. When betrayed, she cannot return to her former self, and so she disappears into snow. The dance was haunting. It asked not for beauty but for anguish, not for elegance but for surrender. My teacher, Madame Kede, had only taught it to a few students over the years. When she handed me the fan, painted silver and white like a frozen feather, she said, "This is not a roll, it is a shedding." I rehearsed it each evening in solitude, the tatami cool beneath my feet, the shadows long and still. I let myself drift into the character, not imitating her sorrow, but breathing it as if it were mine. And maybe in some ways, it was. The first time I performed it for a private guest, the room remained still for several long moments after the final pose. I was crouched low, arms folded like wings broken inward, head bowed. The silence was so absolute I thought for a moment that I had failed, that I had missed a step, broken the spell. Then a single clap, and another, soft, slow, reverent. When I lifted my eyes, I saw one of the older guests, someone who had known Geisha since before the war, wipe a tear from his cheek. He bowed low before me. "You reminded me," he whispered, "that some stories are beautiful because they cannot last." That night, I returned to my room and lit the candle early again. I opened the journal and wrote, "To be held is not always to be kept. Some hands offer warmth, others a cage. The difference lies in what they ask of your wings. The following morning, I asked Okasan to meet me in the tea room. She arrived in silence, her face composed as always, her steps unhurried. I bowed deeply. I have decided, I said. She said nothing, waiting. I will not accept Adana. Her expression did not change, but I could feel the shift in the room, like the air had grown thinner. Why? She asked, her voice as still as the surface of tea before it is stirred. Because I am still becoming, I said, and I cannot give what is not yet formed. She studied me for a long moment. You may not receive another offer like this. I understand. And you may find, she added, that the world is less forgiving when you stand alone. I met her gaze. I would rather be alone than preserved. A silence passed between us. Then she rose, adjusted the sleeve of her kimono, and said only, "So be it." She left without another word. But that evening, when the lanterns were being lit and I passed by her chambers, I saw her door slightly ajar. On her writing desk was a slip of parchment. The top line read, "The heron flew northward." No signature, no explanation, only that. A nod, perhaps, from a woman who had learned long ago how to speak in gestures rather than declarations. The days that followed were strange. The others treated me gently, as though I had returned from something invisible. There was no celebration, no judgment, only a new space around me, both isolating and sacred. I resumed my schedule. I danced. I poured sake. I listened to the quiet complaints of aging patrons, to the flirtations disguised as poetry, to the laughter that never reached the eyes. But something had changed, not in what I did, but in how I carried it. I was no longer trying to be seen. I was no longer trying to be chosen. I had chosen myself, and in doing so, I began to feel the strength of something I hadn't known I was building. Not fame, not beauty, but presence. The ability to exist without explanation, to walk the edge of the stage without fear of falling, to dance not for the applause, but because it was how I breathed. The rainy season came early that year. It arrived like a secret that couldn't be held any longer, spilling suddenly over rooftops and down narrow streets. Jaun transformed into a world of reflections. Puddles mirrored lanterns. Rain traced invisible lines along the worn stone alleys, turning every corner into a shimmer of movement. Even the laughter at the Okaya grew softer, wrapped in the hush of falling water. For the geisha, rain was both a nuisance and a companion. Our silk kimono had to be protected, our makeup shielded with wide-brimmed casa hats and paper umbrellas. Yet there was something in the rain that felt familiar, an echo of the way we moved, slowly, elegantly, with purpose, always beneath the surface of what others could see. The change in season also brought a shift in engagements. Outdoor performances were canceled or moved indoors, and the guests who visited came seeking warmth, not spectacle. They wanted stories now, quiet conversations, shared silences, poems recited beside the hearth. The Okaya became less a stage and more a retreat. I began to notice that I was requested not for the music or the dance or even the elegance, but for presence. "You listen like a lantern," one guest said. "You don't chase the flame, you simply hold it." I wasn't sure what that meant, not entirely, but I accepted it with a bow, as I had learned to do. One night, after a particularly long engagement, I walked home alone. It was late. The streets were empty, slick with rain. My umbrella made soft tapping sounds with every step, and the sound of water dripping from rooftops echoed like a slow metronome. I passed a small shrine tucked in the corner of an alley and paused. The offering tray held only a single plum, split open by the weather. I stood there for a moment, not sure why I had stopped. Then, almost without thinking, I reached into my sleeve and pulled out the folded parchment I had carried for months, the poem given to me by the blind poet. She never said goodbye, but her silence in the wind was louder than spring. I placed it beside the plum, a quiet offering, a letting go, not of pain but of weight. When I returned to the Okiya, the house was asleep. The hallway lanterns had been dimmed, and the scent of incense hung faintly in the air. I passed by Aika's room and paused. Through the thin shoji screen, I could hear the soft pluck of her shamisen, slow and hesitant. Not practice, not performance, just her fingers searching for something in the notes. I sat outside her door and listened. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. Then her voice, barely above a whisper, "Are you still there?" "I am," I replied, a pause. Then I thought about leaving. I waited. I received a letter, she continued. My sister is ill. Mother wants me to come home. I said no, but I think about it every day. The rain tapped gently against the eaves. I don't know what to tell you, I said. Only that leaving isn't always the hardest choice. Sometimes staying is. She didn't answer, but when I rose and walked back to my room, I knew she understood. The next morning we found a letter beside her futon. No words, only her name, written in clean brushstrokes and a folded hairpin, the one she wore when she first debuted. She had left before dawn. Sumire cried quietly in the kitchen while preparing tea. I swept the Ngawa with slower strokes, pausing often to look out at the rain-soaked garden. Okasan said nothing at all. We did not speak of Aika again, not directly, but I knew she wasn't forgotten. The air remembered her footsteps, the walls her laughter. The room she once occupied remained empty for a week, and each time I passed by, I half expected to hear her voice rising in song, just a little off-key. That night, I returned to my journal. She did not ask for permission, only for forgiveness, and perhaps not even that. Some departures are not escapes, but homecomings. Days passed, the rain softened. I was invited to perform at a small inn on the outskirts of the city. A quiet place, surrounded by forest, where the air smelled of wet earth and cedar. The engagement was intimate. Only 4 guests, all old friends, seated on the floor with cups of warm umeshu between them. They asked for a simple dance, nothing grand. I performed shigure, a short piece named after the early winter rain. It was gentle, subdued, filled with pauses, a dance less about motion and more about breath. Afterwards, one of the guests approached me. Your dance reminds me of waiting for someone who never arrives, he said, but also of accepting that they won't. I bowed, and I thought of Aika, of Mariko, of Haruki, of the many names I had gathered like fallen leaves, each brushed by the same wind, each carried away before I could fully hold them. The rainy season would end soon. The petals would not return, but I remained, and perhaps for now, that was enough. The rain stopped without ceremony. One morning, I opened the sliding window of my room and found the air changed, still cool, but clearer, lighter. The streets glistened in the sun, not from rain, but from the polish left behind by days of washing. Gion looked scrubbed clean, like a freshly inked painting, its colors richer after the gray. The moss in the garden had deepened to emerald. The sky, once veiled in silk mist, now stretched wide and open, and with the sun, the sounds returned. Merchants called again from their stalls. Wooden carts creaked past the okiya. Children's laughter bounced off the stone walls as they chased each other around corners. Summer had not arrived, not yet, but it stood just outside the gate, waiting patiently to be invited in. Inside the okiya, something else had begun to stir. The house had grown quiet in the weeks after Aika left, but it wasn't the silence of mourning. It was a silence that listened, a space left open for whatever came next. Sumire had started rising earlier, practicing longer, her sleeves flying through the morning light with new purpose. Okasan began inviting younger girls from neighboring okiya to observe our rehearsals, something she hadn't done in over a year. And I found myself becoming a guide, not formally, not with titles or authority, but the girls began to watch me differently. They asked questions in the way apprentices do when they don't want to offend, framed as compliments embedded in admiration. Your step is so light, one whispered. How do you keep the hem from brushing? Another asked. When you bow, how do you keep your eyes from trembling? I had no answers, only instincts shaped by repetition and a heart that no longer feared the pause between movements. One evening, a girl named Yuna was sent to assist me at an engagement. She was young, newly debuted, her skin still flushed with the blush of uncertainty. Her steps were precise but hesitant, like she knew the right tempo but feared trusting it. As we prepared in the mirror room, she fumbled with the cord of her obi, her hands trembling. Breathe, I said. She looked up at me, startled. You're not tying a knot, I said gently. You're shaping your spine. She stared for a moment, then slowly, breath by breath, tried again. When we arrived at the Oshaya, the hostess led us to a private parlor on the second floor. It was dim, warm with candlelight, the screens painted with cranes in flight. The guest was an elderly man, thin and elegant, his hair combed neatly into a silver crown. A retired painter, we were told, who had once been famous but had since vanished from the public eye. He did not speak at first. He simply watched us as we poured his tea, his gaze heavy but not unkind. When the music began and I rose to dance, I felt Yuna's eyes on me. I could sense her breath syncing with mine. Every turn I made was deliberate, not just for the guest, but for her, for the girl who would one day dance on her own in some distant room under someone else's eyes. When it ended, the painter spoke. You dance like someone who has already lived the ending. I bowed. He turned to Yuna. And you, remember that fear is only grace, not yet practiced. On our way back through the moonlit streets, Yuna was quiet. At the gate of the Okia, she stopped and said, "Will I ever stop shaking?" I smiled. "Yes," I said, "but you will miss it when it's gone." That night, I wrote in my journal, I am no longer trying to become the geisha I imagined. I am becoming the woman I never knew I could be. One who can hold space. One who can be still without vanishing. The days passed with an ease I had not known in years. I no longer fought the structure of the life around me. I moved through it with rhythm, but no longer with resistance. Like rain through a bamboo pipe, directed yes, but never unnatural. I had come to accept that I might never truly belong outside this world, that the Okia, for all its constraints, had become a kind of home. And yet, not a cage, not anymore. I had begun to learn how to live inside the ritual without losing the part of me that existed before it. The girl from the seaside, the one who chased dragonflies and waited for the tide. She had not disappeared. She had simply learned how to bow. That summer, Okasan brought me a letter. It was written on pale green paper, the handwriting precise and familiar. At first, I didn't recognize it. Then I saw the seal at the bottom. Yamamura. I had not thought of him in months. After I refused the Dana proposal, I assumed that was the end. We were taught not to dwell on the doors we closed, especially when they closed quietly. But the letter was not a second proposal. It was a poem. Some flowers bloom once, not for harvest, but for life. Thank you for your spring. No name, no return address. Only that. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it inside my journal. And then I went to the garden, where the moss was thick and warm beneath my feet, and I sat beside the stone lantern and watched the dragonflies dart over the koi pond. I did not cry. I did not smile. I simply breathed. Because some poems are not meant to answer, only to echo. And some choices I now understood are not made once, but lived again every day in silence, in stillness, in the way we carry the names that never belonged to us and the ones we quietly grow into. Summer pressed itself onto the city like a warm hand on silk, insistent, heavy, and slow. The nights lengthened into honeyed twilight, and the air grew thick with the perfume of blooming lilies and the distant tang of river water. John shimmered under the weight of heat and tradition, each breath a negotiation with the sun. In the Okia, we adapted as we always did. Our kimono grew lighter in fabric, our sleeves shorter, our hair adorned with summer motifs. Goldfish, morning glories, fireflies. The fans in our hands were no longer just props, but lifelines, fluttering constantly to stir what little breeze they could find. Cold barley tea replaced hot matcha. Even the laughter in the Ochaya was slower now, like a song played in half time. Despite the heat, summer was one of our busiest seasons. The Gion Matsuri, the grand festival that drew travelers from every corner of Japan, filled the district with celebration. Drums echoed down the stone lanes, and ornate floats crawled through the streets like great, breathing creatures. Every evening, the Ochaya were filled with guests looking to escape the crowd's press and seek refuge in quiet conversation, graceful performances, and the soft clink of sake against porcelain. It was during this season of golden nights and restless days that I was summoned for an unusual engagement. A performance at a riverside villa, far from the city's pulse, nestled in the hills beyond the Kamo River. The host, I was told, was a collector, not just of art or antiques, but of stories. A man known for hosting gatherings where no names were exchanged, only voices. Where the geisha invited were asked to bring not just dances or music, but memories. Not entertainment, the messenger had explained. Intimacy. He wants a story. Okasan approved the request with a nod, her face unreadable. The evening of the performance, I dressed in my palest summer kimono, an ivory silk with hand-painted irises trailing along the hem. My obi was the color of rain-soaked stone, and my hair was pulled back with a single pin carved from cherry wood. I felt lighter, almost weightless, as I boarded the palanquin and was carried toward the hills. The villa was quiet, surrounded by tall pines and the steady murmur of a stream nearby. I was led through wooden corridors to a small tatami room lit by oil lamps. The air smelled of cedar and fresh ink. Inside, 5 guests sat in a loose circle. None wore formal attire. Their expressions were relaxed, expectant, curious. The host, a man in his late 60s with silver-streaked hair and a thoughtful gaze, motioned for me to sit. "We've already had 2 stories tonight," he said gently. "A lost watch found 20 years later in a koi pond, and a dream of a train that never stops." The others chuckled softly. He turned to me. "And you, Michael-san, what story have you brought?" I paused, folding my hands in my lap. Then I began. I told them about a painting I once saw in a market stall as a child, of a woman standing on a cliff's edge, her hair blown sideways, her face turned away. I had begged my mother to buy it, though we had no money to spare. For years I dreamed of that painting, wondering what she had been looking at or waiting for. I never saw it again. But sometimes, I said, when the wind is strong enough, I remember her. When I finished, no one spoke. The host bowed his head slightly. "Some stories don't need endings," he said. Later that night, as the other guests drifted away, the host approached me by the garden gate. "You've walked through more seasons than most," he said. I smiled faintly. "I've learned to move quietly through them." He looked at me for a moment. "Don't be afraid to bloom loudly." I bowed and returned to the okiya as the moon rose above the pine trees, full and pale and watching. That night, I could not sleep. Instead, I lit a candle and opened my journal. Some stories are not told with words, but with stillness, with the weight of breath held just a moment too long, with the way a hand hovers over a fan before deciding not to open it. The next morning, a new apprentice arrived at the okiya. A girl no older than 13, her eyes wide with the strange mixture of fear and determination I had seen in myself so many years ago. She bowed too quickly. Her sleeves trailed improperly. Her sandals were slightly mismatched. Sumire met my gaze from across the room and smiled. I approached the girl, knelt beside her, and reached out to gently adjust her collar. "This part," I said, "should always rest just below the curve of your neck. Not because it's easier to move, but because it shows where you come from." She looked up at me confused. I smiled. "You'll understand with time." And I realized then with a quiet, startling certainty, I had become a part of the house now. Not just a name spoken in bookings or a figure behind painted eyes. I had become a presence, a steady hand, a still current beneath the rituals. Not because I had sought it, but because I had remained. And in remaining, I had grown roots deep enough to hold others as they too learned to become. The days grew hotter, then lazier. Summer's weight began to press not only on the air, but on our very bones. By late July, even the okiya seemed to breathe slower. The floorboards radiated warmth. Our makeup threatened to soften under the humidity, and we found ourselves speaking less, conserving energy between engagements. Fans became permanent extensions of our hands, flicking open with practiced grace in every room. In this heat, time folded. Days bled into evenings, and evenings into nights filled with the whirring song of cicadas that never seemed to stop. Their voices were a constant chorus outside our windows, shrill, relentless, haunting, as if the trees themselves were straining to say something, over and over again. We performed almost every night, despite the heat. Summer brought tourists and travelers, businessmen on retreat, poets seeking inspiration. Many of them requested me now, and I came to recognize certain faces, certain names, not as people exactly, but as seasons that returned with predictable cadence. One evening, I was summoned to perform at a riverside oshaya, famous for its seasonal kaiseki dinners, elegant, multi-course meals meant to reflect the spirit of the hour. The room where we gathered was dim, cooled by the breeze drifting off the river, with soft lanterns swaying above. As I stepped onto the tatami, I noticed one of the guests watching me closely. He was young, unusual for a regular patron. His features were sharp, his yukata worn casually but with care. He didn't speak during the meal, only listened. But when I danced, he watched with a stillness that was neither hunger nor awe. After the performance, as I was preparing to leave, he rose and bowed. "I studied in Europe," he said quietly, in perfectly polite Japanese. "But nothing ever felt as distant as this room, and yet tonight I felt like I belonged to something." I bowed, Unsure of how to respond, he continued, "You move like someone who has made peace with vanishing." Then he smiled, as if catching himself being too forward, and left before I could reply. That night, I returned home and sat on the Ngawa well past midnight, watching fireflies drift in and out of the garden shadows. Their light pulsed faintly, inconsistently, but without fear. Made peace with vanishing. I turned the phrase over in my mind, again and again. Was that what I had done? Not surrendered, not disappeared, but made peace? Inside, the new apprentice, her name was Rai, cried softly in her sleep. The first few weeks were always hardest. The ache of unfamiliarity, the weight of ritual, the slow erosion of the self you arrived with. In the morning, I found her sitting alone in the practice room, her shamisen in her lap, unmoving. "I can't," she whispered as I entered. "My fingers won't remember. I try, but they forget." I knelt beside her. "You're not trying to remember a song," I said. "You're trying to remember yourself." She looked at me, confused. I picked up the shamisen and began to play the opening of Sakura, Sakura, an old melody, one every apprentice learned. My fingers moved slowly, gently, as if waking something, not forcing it. Ray watched. Then, hesitantly, she placed her fingers on the strings and joined me. The notes were unsteady, but present. When we finished, I said, "You don't need to be perfect yet, just present." She nodded, her eyes damp but grateful. Later that day, I performed a short piece for a visiting photographer. He had come from Nagoya, seeking images for a magazine series on traditional arts. He was respectful, quiet, and only took a single photo, after I finished, not during. That photo, he said, would appear in black and white. "Color distracts from truth," he told me. I wasn't sure I agreed, but it made me think. After he left, I looked at myself in the mirror, still dressed in my performance kimono. I imagined myself in monochrome. No red lips, no lavender sleeves, no gold in the folds of my obi. What would remain? The shape of my body, the shadows beneath my eyes, the line of my collarbone, the stillness, the quiet, the years. And then perhaps the woman I had become. I lit a candle and opened my journal. There is a difference between being still and being empty, between fading and softening. The firefly's light does not scream. It pulses, it waits, it endures. That evening after dinner, Okasan called a meeting. We gathered in the main room, the rice paper windows glowing from the sunset's last rays. Sumire sat beside me, and Ray knelt quietly at the edge of the group. "A new season is coming," Okasan said. "We must prepare." She looked at each of us, her eyes slow, searching. "There is talk," she continued, "of an official recognition. One of our own may be nominated to perform at the Imperial Autumn Ceremony in Kyoto." The room stilled. This was rare, an honor of honors. Few geisha, even in the most respected Hanamachi, were ever invited to such a stage. "We do not know yet who they will select," Okasan said, "but we must be ready." She looked at me for a moment longer than the others, not with favoritism, but with knowledge. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I stood in the garden again, my bare feet pressing into the earth. The cicadas had quieted at last. The moon hung low and full over the roofline. I did not dream of being chosen, only of dancing beneath that sky, unseen, unaccompanied, for no one but the wind, and of how beautiful it felt to still belong to something, entirely, quietly, deeply, without needing to be owned. By the time August settled over Kyoto like a shawl of fire, even the stones beneath our feet radiated heat. The alleyways of Gion shimmered with mirages. The air between buildings rippled with invisible waves. We kept cold towels tucked in our sleeves, and even the slightest breeze from a paper fan felt like a mercy. The days slowed to a crawl, but still, we moved. We always moved. Inside the Okiya, preparations took on a new energy. Rumors continued to circulate about the Imperial Autumn Ceremony. Official invitations had not yet been sent, but the whispers grew louder. Teachers became stricter. Schedules lengthened. We practiced dances more meticulously, each gesture inspected, each turn corrected. Our meals were lighter, our sleep shorter. The house no longer rested, it waited. One morning, just after sunrise, Madame Kade summoned me to the studio. She sat cross-legged by the lacquered floor, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The windows were open, letting in the scent of pine and warm earth. "I have chosen your dance," she said. I knelt before her without speaking. "You will perform Tsuruno Sugomori, the nesting of cranes." I looked up, startled. It was not a common piece, it was only the most refined dancers. Its movements were slow, deliberate, filled with silences that carried more weight than any flourish. It is a dance of devotion, she continued, of grace held within restraint. It requires a kind of stillness you have only recently begun to understand. I bowed deeply. I will do my best. She nodded, but her eyes remained steady. No, you must do more than that. That evening, I began practicing in solitude. The dance told the story of a pair of cranes building their nest in the high reeds, loyal to one another, tending to their fragile world with patience and care. The steps were subtle. A glance, a pause, the slow arc of the arm, as though weaving air into shelter. It was not a performance meant to impress, but to humble, and it humbled me. I stumbled through the silences, unsure of how to carry them. I felt exposed by the stillness, uncertain of how to remain open without revealing too much. Each movement asked not for perfection, but for presence. And presence, I learned, was far more difficult to maintain than elegance. One afternoon, while rehearsing alone, I noticed Ray watching from behind the screen. She held a fan in both hands, eyes wide with something between reverence and fear. I motioned for her to step inside. She hesitated, then crept forward on silent feet, kneeling beside the open window. "What do you see?" I asked her gently. She looked at me, startled. I don't know." "Close your eyes," I said. She did. I danced the next phrase again, the long, arching sweep of the arm, the slow lowering of the hand to the floor, the stillness that followed. When I finished, I asked again, "Now what do you see?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she whispered, "It looked like waiting for someone who never left." I smiled. "Good," I said. Then the story is beginning to live. That night, I returned to my journal. Some dances do not ask you to become someone else. They ask you to return to who you are when no one is looking. A week later, Okasan received word from the Kyoto Arts Council, a letter stamped with the seal of the Imperial Ministry, hand-delivered, wrapped in silk cord. She summoned me alone to the tea room. The light filtered through the shoji in long, narrow strips. The kettle steamed quietly. She poured the tea herself as she had once done before, years ago, when I had still believed form was all there was. "You have been selected," she said without preamble. I bowed, forehead to the mat. "You will represent this house and this city, not as a girl in makeup, not as a decoration, but as an echo of something much older than any of us." I stayed bowed a moment longer, letting the weight of the words settle into my spine. When I looked up, she held my gaze. "This is not praise," she said. "It is responsibility." I understood. The days that followed moved with unfamiliar clarity. Every gesture became purposeful, every moment a preparation. I rose earlier, slept less, ate quietly. Even the younger girls watched me now with a different kind of reverence, less for what I had achieved and more for what I was expected to carry. On the morning of the fitting, I was presented with the kimono I would wear. It was made of midnight blue silk, embroidered with a pair of white cranes in flight. Their wings stretched across the back, their beaks nearly touching at the collar. The hem was weighted with gold thread, heavy enough to ground the lightest step. When I first slipped it on, I could feel the generations stitched into it. The years, the women who had worn it before me, their footsteps beneath mine. Later that evening, I lit a single candle and knelt before the mirror. I did not paint my face. I did not tie my hair. I simply sat and watched the woman staring back at me. She was not smiling. She was not weeping. She was still. And in that stillness, I saw not the Geisha I had become, but the life I had woven, thread by thread, from silence, from refusal, from grace, and from the quiet promise that no matter the dance, I would always be my own. The day of the Imperial Autumn Ceremony arrived under a sky the color of lacquered jade, deep, cloudless, and full of stillness. The city moved quietly that morning. Even the wind seemed to hush its breath as if in reverence. From the moment I awoke, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like stepping into a room where everyone is already watching. The okiya was wrapped in ceremonial silence. No clattering dishes, no hushed gossip, no hurried footsteps. Every motion was slow, deliberate. Sumire helped dress me, her fingers steady, her own expression unreadable. She tied the obi with such care I felt the fabric lift and settle around me like a whisper. The kimono, that midnight blue silk embroidered with the white cranes, draped over my shoulders like nightfall. It felt heavier than it had during the fitting, not physically, but in meaning. Each fold, Each thread held the weight of countless eyes, unspoken expectations, and something deeper still, memory. When I stepped into the courtyard, Okasan was already waiting. She looked at me for a long time. Then, without a word, she stepped forward and adjusted the fall of my sleeve by a single inch. "There," she said. It was her way of saying I was ready. A palanquin took me from Jian to the ceremonial hall, an ancient structure nestled within the imperial gardens. Its wooden beams had been blackened by centuries of sun and time. As I was helped down, I caught sight of the pine trees lining the path, their twisted branches casting long, sharp shadows across the stone. A shiver passed through me, despite the warmth of the day. Inside, the hall was austere and echoing. Tatami mats stretched beneath high ceilings, and light filtered through paper windows, casting delicate patterns across the polished floor. Musicians sat at the far end, their instruments already tuned. Along the sides, government officials and guests of the court knelt in quiet rows. There was no applause. There were no introductions, only the soft sound of the kodo's first notes rising like mist. And then I stepped forward. I do not remember the dance as a sequence. I remember it as breath, as a pulse moving beneath my skin. The first motion, a deep grounded bow, opened something in my chest. My arms moved like wings, not flapping but gliding, reaching, holding. I did not perform the crane story. I lived it, nesting, waiting, longing, protecting, letting go. Each stillness was a statement, each silence a song. I heard nothing but the hush of silk against air, the occasional sigh from the audience, the soft cry of the few flute winding like wind through the pines. I did not think of perfection. I did not worry about memory. I simply was. When I lowered myself into the final pose, one knee bent, one hand folded over the other like the resting head of a bird, I stayed there, suspended in time until the music faded. Only then did I rise. Only then did I return. I bowed once, deeply. The hall remained silent. And then, softly, respectfully, someone placed their palms together in a gesture of thanks. A murmur of acknowledgement followed. Not applause, but recognition. I was escorted from the stage, my feet barely feeling the ground. Behind the curtain, an attendant offered me a towel and a cup of water. I sipped quietly, my hands trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from something else. A release, a closing, a moment I had been walking toward for years. Later that evening, after the return journey and the quiet congratulatory bows from the house, I found myself alone in the garden. The sun had long since dipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky streaked with fading gold. I sat on the old stone bench, still in the ceremonial kimono, and let the evening settle around me. It was not triumph I felt, not even pride. It was stillness. The stillness of something completed, not ended, but fully lived. I thought of the girl who once knelt in this same garden, trembling in unfamiliar shoes. I thought of the sea and the salt wind and the boy who gave me a shell to remember the world I came from. I thought of Mariko, of Aika, of Madame Kade, of Okasan, of every woman who had danced in silence so that I might speak with my body. Then I reached into my sleeve and took out the folded journal page I had carried with me all day. I unfolded it carefully and reread the lines I had written the night before. When the crane builds her nest, it is not to be seen. It is to hold what cannot fly yet. And when she flies, she leaves the nest beautiful, even in her absence. I folded the paper again and placed it beside the lantern. Then I stood, and for the first time in a long time, I walked inside, not as someone becoming, but as someone who had arrived. Autumn came without asking. It slipped beneath the doors and through the thin cotton of our sleeves, wrapped itself around the evening wind, and laid its golden hand gently across the garden stones. One morning, I woke to find a single red maple leaf resting on the windowsill, perfectly still, as if placed there on purpose. A quiet sign, a whisper that something had changed. The imperial ceremony had passed, yet its echo lingered in the walls of the Okiya. Not in conversation, none of us spoke of it directly, but in the way people moved around me, more gently, with more caution. The apprentices bowed deeper, their eyes lingering a moment longer. Sumire spoke to me more softly, as though aware that some part of me had gone somewhere distant and had not yet fully returned. Even Okasan watched me differently now, less as her student, more as someone she had entrusted with something sacred. But with that reverence came distance. And in that distance, I began to feel a new kind of solitude, Not loneliness, solitude. It was not painful. It was not empty. It was simply wide, like walking into a large room and hearing only your own footsteps. For the first time in years, my calendar was cleared for a week. A gift from Okasan, perhaps, or a silent instruction to rest. I took it as a sign, and without ceremony, I packed a small satchel, wrapped my travel kimono, and left Kyoto for the coast. The sea greeted me like an old friend. The wind was sharper there, brined and unruly. It caught the edge of my sleeve and tugged at it as I walked down the familiar paths, past the shrine where I once prayed as a child, past the market where the air smelled of dried squid and fermented plum. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I found my mother's house still standing, smaller than I remembered, slouched slightly at the edges, but warm. She answered the door with flour on her hands and a softness in her eyes that neither questioned nor celebrated my return. We did not cry. We did not speak of Geisha or Kyoto or the years in between. We cooked rice. She showed me how the garden had grown over. We mended an old shawl together. I helped her sweep the porch. In the evening, we drank tea and sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the sea like it always had. The same rhythm, the same pause before the stars arrived. On the third day, I walked to the hill overlooking the harbor, the one I used to sit on as a girl. The grass there was coarser than I remembered, more tangled, but when I sat down, it felt the same. From that hill, I could see the fishing boats bobbing gently, the light bouncing off the waves like silver threads being stitched into the horizon. And I remembered Haruki, his voice, his laughter, his muddy knees, the sound of him breathing beside me on this very hill, telling me stories about whales that swallowed clouds and fish that sang when the moon was full. I closed my eyes and let the wind blow through my hair, untied and loose now. I no longer needed pins to hold myself in place. That night, I found the shell he gave me, still hidden in the corner of my old room, in a box lined with rice paper and bits of dry lavender. It was smaller than I recalled, pale and chipped at one edge, but when I held it to my ear, I could still hear the hush of the ocean, faint, like memory, but present. I returned to Kyoto 2 days later. No one asked where I had gone. But Sumire looked at me, paused, and said, "You've changed again." I only smiled. In the weeks that followed, I resumed my place within the Okiya, but not as before. Something had shifted. The rituals felt gentler, the rehearsals less urgent. I no longer performed out of duty, but out of rhythm. My movements became more fluid, not out of practice, but out of knowing. As if the story I had been dancing for years had finally unfolded its last page. One evening, Ray knocked softly on my door. She stood holding a folded slip of paper. "I wrote a poem," she said, eyes lowered. I opened it carefully. The brushwork was unsure, the lines uneven, but the words made something inside me go still. A bird once watched the mountain until the mountain moved. Now she watches the wind instead. I looked at her. She blushed, eyes wide. "I didn't know if it made sense," she whispered. "It does," I said. "It makes more than sense." That night I walked once again to the garden. The maple leaves had begun to fall in earnest now, gathering in corners like secret letters waiting to be read. I knelt by the koi pond, watching the fish move slowly beneath the surface, unhurried. I did not bring my journal. I did not need to write. Instead, I whispered to the water. I have not stopped becoming, but I have learned how to rest. And for the first time in all my years, behind painted eyes and silent footsteps, I let myself simply be. The first rain of late autumn came in the early hours of morning, soft as breath against the windows, threading its way through the quiet streets of Gion. I heard it before I saw it, the gentle tapping on the roof tiles, the hush of water slipping down the bamboo gutters. By the time I opened my door, the courtyard stones were glistening, and the air was laced with the smell of wet pine and cooled earth. Inside the Okiya, the mood had shifted once more. After the intensity of summer and the solemnity of the imperial ceremony, a calm had taken hold. The younger girls practiced with renewed steadiness, their laughter returning in soft bursts over shared cups of tea. Ray had begun to hum while brushing her sleeves in the morning, a habit that reminded me of Aika before her departure. Even Okasan's footsteps, once sharp and decisive, now moved more slowly, as though carried by reflection rather than routine. As for me, I found myself drawn inward, not withdrawn, but contemplative. as if I had finally stepped out from behind a curtain I hadn't known was there and was now watching the stage from the other side. I performed less frequently that season, by choice. When invitations came, I accepted selectively. Only the quiet gatherings, the tea ceremonies hosted in private homes, the moon viewings where music was played softly and no one asked for encores. I had begun to seek not applause, but resonance. Not admiration, but alignment. One particular evening, I was asked to perform at a poetry salon hosted by a calligraphy master who lived in a townhouse near the Kamogawa River. His gatherings were legendary among artists, attended not by the wealthy or the powerful, but by those who cherished beauty in its barest forms. Potters, sculptors, painters, poets who preferred worn brushes over printed books. The room was small, papered in soft grays, with a single scroll hanging behind the low dais where I was to dance. It bore only one character, drawn in a single stroke, emptiness. I stood barefoot on the tatami as the guests poured warm sake and recited verse. No one spoke above a whisper. The air was filled not with expectation but permission. And when the music began, a lone shakuhachi, breathy and slow, I danced not with precision but with presence. There was no choreography that night, only instinct, only pauses, only breath turned into movement and movement into quiet. When it ended, the calligraphy master approached and bowed, deep and wordless. Then he handed me a folded sheet of rice paper, ink still drying. I read it days later, sitting beneath the maple tree in the Okiya garden. The poem was brief. The flower does not ask why it was chosen to bloom, only how long to stay. I closed my eyes and let the words drift into the wind. That week, Sumire left the Okiya. She had received an offer from a prominent patron in Kanazawa to curate performances and train new dancers for a cultural institute. It was a natural evolution for her, a quiet rising that felt inevitable. There was no ceremony, no farewell, only a shared cup of tea in the kitchen as the sun cast gold through the lattice windows. "You'll stay?" she asked me. "For now," I said. She nodded. "That's enough." After she left, the house felt larger, not emptier, but more echoing, like a temple after prayer. And then, a few days later, Okasan called me to the tea room. She was seated alone, no tea prepared, her kimono unusually plain, ash gray with no ornament. Her hair was down, a rare sight. Her eyes were calm, but something in them had softened. "I'm retiring," she said. The word fell into the space between us like a stone dropped into still water. "I've arranged for the house to continue," she added. "You will be offered the role of Atotori, successor." I bowed but said nothing. She studied me. "You don't have to accept. You've already become more than I could have hoped. But if you do, the house will follow your rhythm." I looked at her, seeing her not as the stern figure who once corrected my vows or refused to praise, but as a woman shaped by duty, like the smooth underside of a river stone, hardened by years, softened by time. "What will you do?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Rest. Walk. Perhaps remember who I was before I became needed." We sat together a while longer, not as mistress and Maiko, but as two women who had carried the same silence in different ways. When she rose to leave, she turned and said, "You've danced enough for others. Now let the house dance with you." That night, I walked the Okiya corridors after everyone had gone to bed. The lamps flickered low, casting long shadows across the paper walls. I paused at each door, raised, now silent, the empty room that had once been Aika's, the studio where Madame Kaide's voice still seemed to echo. Then I stepped into the garden, barefoot, and stood beneath the maple. The last of its leaves fluttered down around me, red and crisp and weightless. I knelt and touched the earth. It was cold, but alive. And I knew then, this house had never belonged to just one woman. It belonged to the footsteps of all who had passed through its rooms, and now it would hold mine. The announcement was made without ceremony. No feast, no ribbons, no formal gathering, just a short letter posted to the registry and a quiet notice delivered to the neighboring Okiya. I had accepted the role of Atotori, successor, caretaker of the house, and the generations that would follow. I read the letter once, folded it, and tucked it into the inner sleeve of my kimono. The ink wasn't even fully dry, the brush marks still soft to the touch. The rest of the day moved as any other. The floor was swept, the tea was brewed, the apprentices practiced their bows. But I felt it, quietly, in the shift of footsteps, the sudden hush when I entered a room. The way Ray straightened her back while pouring tea as if I might be watching more closely now. Okasan left 2 days later, just after dawn. She carried no luggage, only a lacquered box and a woven shawl draped around her shoulders. She didn't summon us for a farewell. She didn't want one. But as she stepped through the gate, I stood on the Ngawa and bowed deeply, holding the gesture until I heard her footsteps fade into the morning. I didn't cry, because it wasn't an ending. It was a passing. And the house, once hers, had opened like a palm beneath my feet. That first week, I kept everything as it had been, not out of fear, but out of respect. The order of the lessons, the layout of the kitchen, even the vase in the entrance hall remained untouched. The apprentices, 3 of them now, all between the ages of 12 and 16, moved with a cautious kind of reverence. They were still testing the shape of my leadership, watching to see if the person I was in dance remained the same outside of it. But I wasn't. Not entirely. Late one evening, I found myself in the record room, where ledgers were kept detailing every engagement, every expense, every guest who had passed through the house since before the war. The paper was brittle. Some entries were written in fading ink. I traced the names with my finger, Muriko's, Aika's, even mine, inked in neat brushstrokes, the first time I had ever been formally requested. And beside it, the name I remembered most, Haruki. I stared at it for a long while. The date, the location, the note in the margin. Requested private attendance, no follow-up. I closed the ledger gently, and I realized then that a house is not made of rooms and paper walls. It is made of memory, of breath and shadow, of words not spoken aloud, and dances that live in the body long after the music fades. The next morning, I began to change things. Slowly, quietly, I moved the practice sessions from midday to early morning, when the body is softest and most honest. I allowed Ray to choose her own dance for the next seasonal festival, a small gesture, but one that gave her eyes a spark I had never seen before. I removed the rule forbidding apprentices from writing outside of their assignments. I placed blank journals in their rooms without explanation. When they asked, I only said, a geisha's silence is her strength, but it should never be her prison. I resumed performing too, but only on special occasions, no longer to be seen, now only to share. One evening, I danced for a visiting musician from the north, an old man who played the biwa with fingers stiff from age, but whose music still held the weight of oceans. We performed together in a tiny room lit by candlelight. No audience. Only Ray watching from the threshold, her breath caught in her hands. After the final note, the musician bowed and said, "You do not dance to impress." "I don't," I replied. "I dance to return." Later, Ray asked what I meant. "To what?" she whispered. I looked at her, so young, so full of questions still forming. "To the part of myself I forget during the day," I said. "The one that only lives when I'm not pretending." The leaves had nearly all fallen from the trees by then. The maple in our garden stood bare, its branches thin against the deepening sky. The koi had gone quiet in the pond, their movements slow, their bodies drifting near the bottom where the water stayed warm. That night, I returned to my mirror for the first time in weeks. Not to paint my face, not to arrange my hair, just to look. The woman staring back wore no makeup, no ornaments. Her kimono was simple, her hands unadorned. But her eyes, those were different. They no longer searched the edges of the reflection, trying to find someone lost in the folds. They looked straight ahead, still, quiet, but certain. I reached into my sleeve and took out my old journal. The pages were nearly full now, the spine worn and soft from use. I opened to the last page, dipped my brush in ink and wrote, "I no longer walk in borrowed footsteps. The house does not carry me, I carry it, and we are both learning how to breathe." The first frost came with no warning. I woke before dawn to find the garden silvered, every blade of grass edged in crystal. The koi pond had begun to glaze at its edges, and the wind, which only days ago had been soft with the scent of fallen leaves, now carried the unmistakable hush of winter. Inside, the okia was still. I walked through the corridors alone, my feet soft against the worn tatami. I paused before the main room and watched the shadows of the trees sway faintly across the paper walls. It felt as though the house itself had taken a long breath and was holding it. Winter, after all, was not only a season, it was a temperament, a slowing, a remembering. This would be my first winter as Atotori. It was the season when the geisha world grew quieter. Fewer festivals, fewer engagements, more evenings spent in the intimacy of small gatherings, more moments shared with fewer words. Winter asked for less spectacle, more presence, and I found myself drawn into that rhythm willingly. Ray had begun to flourish. She no longer asked before speaking, and her voice had gained a softness that came not from timidity, but from confidence wrapped in grace. One afternoon, I watched her teaching a younger apprentice how to balance a tray of sweets without spilling the powdered sugar across the lacquer. Her tone was patient, her hands precise. Afterward, I called her to the tea room. "Do you know what you did today?" I asked. She looked unsure. Corrected her? "No," I said. "You remembered how you were once held, and you held someone else the same way." She blinked, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But she only bowed and whispered, "Thank you." Later that night, she left a poem by my door. A tray may be light, but it remembers the weight of who first carried it. I tucked it into my sleeve without a word. My own role began to shift subtly, too. I was invited to more formal meetings now, gatherings with the heads of other okiya, with patrons who funded the seasonal festivals, with artists seeking partnerships for exhibitions and collaborations. I no longer danced as often, but when I did, it was with intention, not obligation. And the name of our house, once whispered as promising, was now spoken with quiet certainty. Under her care, someone had said at a recent tea gathering, the house is not only surviving, it is listening. I took no pride in it, not in the way one might collect compliments, but I felt it in my bones, in the way the walls seemed to hum more softly, in the way the new girls laughed more freely in the garden after practice. One evening, as the last of the autumn moon hung low in the sky, a letter arrived. It was from the temple on the eastern hill, the one that had watched over Gion for centuries. They were hosting a small winter ceremony, a private illumination of the garden lanterns reserved for a few invited guests and benefactors. They had requested a geisha to perform a single dance beneath the lit trees. Not a group, not a celebration, just one. They asked for me. I hesitated. I had not danced alone for an audience in weeks, perhaps longer, but something in the request stirred a memory of the first time I stood beneath a lantern in Gion, so long ago, unsure of how to hold my sleeves, unsure of how to speak without words. And so I accepted. The night of the ceremony, the temple grounds were cold but clear. Lanterns had been placed along the garden path, glowing like small moons. The trees stood bare, their limbs stretched into the night sky, and frost covered the moss like a whisper. There were only a dozen guests. I stepped into the center of the clearing in a winter-white kimono, the hem embroidered with silver cranes and pine needles. No music played, only the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant clack of the wooden bell marking the hour. And then I moved, slowly, intentionally, a dance of breath, of stillness, of returning, not a story of love or loss, not a fable or an echo. Only this, the turning of the season, the holding of silence, the acknowledgement of time. When it ended, no one spoke. They bowed quietly, and then one by one, they left. I remained. The monks brought me a cup of hot tea and offered a place to sit beneath the veranda. I watched the lanterns flicker as the frost crept slowly across the stones, and for the first time in years, I felt the dance remain in my body, not like a weight, but like warmth, not as performance, but as presence. That night, as I walked home alone, I passed the riverbank. The water moved slowly, reflecting the stars above like distant lanterns floating backward. I thought of all I had carried, all I had let go, and all I had become, not because of the world I had entered, but because of how I had chosen to stay. At the gate of the okiya, I paused and looked up. The light in my room was still on. The house was waiting. And now I was ready to walk back in, not as the girl who had once followed behind her seniors, nor even as the woman who had led the stage, but as the keeper of a quiet legacy, one built not on the sound of applause, but on the grace of remaining. The snow came quietly, as it always does. It fell in the early hours of morning, blanketing the tiled roofs and smoothing the lines of the streets until Gion looked like a painting made of hush. The garden at the okiya turned into a still world of white and shadow, the koi pond veiled in ice, the old maple branches drawn bare and delicate against the pale sky. I watched it from the Ngawa, kneeling with a cup of warm roasted tea in my hands. The steam rose in steady threads, catching the cold air like breath exhaled from the earth. Inside, the girls were still asleep. The Okia breathed its own slow rhythm now, not dictated by me or Okasan or even the seasons, but by something deeper. A trust, perhaps. A continuity. I had stopped writing in my journal weeks ago, not because I had nothing more to say, but because I no longer needed to place the truth outside of myself to see it. It lived in me now, quietly, like a stone warmed by sunlight. When Ray joined me that morning, her face half drowsy, she sat beside me without speaking. We sipped tea together, wrapped in our shawls, listening to the snowfall. "I had a dream," she said finally. "Tell me." I was dancing, but not on a stage. On a boat, it was floating slowly down a river, and the audience was the moon. I smiled. "And did you finish the dance?" She shook her head. "No, but I wasn't afraid." I nodded and said nothing more, because she understood now what I had once longed for someone to explain, that not every dance needs an ending. Some only ask that you move with honesty until the current carries you somewhere new. That evening, the house prepared for a private gathering. Just 6 guests, long-standing supporters of the Hanamachi. They were elderly, gentle, and known more for their poetry than their wealth. I wore a charcoal gray kimono embroidered with plum blossoms, a subtle echo of the early spring hidden beneath the snow. I allowed Ray and another apprentice, Kinu, to take the lead. I watched them perform from the back of the room, hands folded, hearts still. They danced well, not flawlessly, but with presence. And presence, I had come to learn, was the only real measure. After the guests had gone and the dishes were cleared, I sat alone in the practice room. The lamp burned low, casting a pool of amber over the polished floor. I rose, slowly, and without fanfare, began to move. No one watched. There was no music, only the memory of it in my breath. I danced Kurakami again, the black hair, the dance of longing, the dance of solitude. I had first learned it when I was still a girl, before I knew what those emotions felt like in my bones. Now, as I moved through each gesture, I felt every silence I had ever carried, every name unspoken, every story held between the ribs like a second heartbeat. And when I finished, I did not bow. I simply stood still, watching the shadow of my form on the wall in front of me. Not bowed, not painted, not adorned. Just myself, a keeper of stories, a vessel for time, a woman. That night, as snow thickened outside, I sat in the tea room and lit one final candle. Not for prayer, not for ceremony, only for acknowledgement. The Okia I knew would go on. With Ray, with Kinu, with others I had not yet met. The garden would bloom again. The bells of John would ring. The Ochaya would fill with voices, and the stage would carry new footsteps. But the story I had once begun, barefoot and uncertain, had reached its quiet completion. I thought of the shell Haruki had once given me, how it echoed the sea not because it was still near the water, but because it remembered, and so did I, not with pain, not with longing, but with peace. I stood, slid open the shoji door, and stepped into the snow-covered garden. No lanterns, no fanfare, only the soft press of snow beneath my feet, only breath in the cold, only the grace of a life lived in silence, movement, and care. And as I looked up, the flakes fell slowly around me, gathering in my hair, on my sleeves, melting against the warmth of my skin. And I understood. Some stories are not written, they are danced. And when the music ends, the silence becomes the most beautiful part of all.